Hopefully most of you guys are familiar with Brandon Sanderson. I just wanted to talk for a couple minutes about some of the things he's been doing lately, and particularly towards inspiration for fellow writers in the MFA department. That's where I'm currently in. When his first book was published, Elantris, Publishers Weekly gave the following review. They said, Sanderson's outstanding fantasy debut, refreshingly complete unto itself and free of the usual genre cliches, offers something for everything. Mystery, magic, romance, political wrangling, religious conflict, fights for equality, sharp writing, and wonderful, robust characters. Since then, Brandon's gone on to publish the Mistborn trilogy. He's done Warbreaker. Hopefully some of you guys have read the recent final book in the Robert Jordan series. And I wanted to talk about a couple of the cool things about what Brandon Sanderson does. We talked about him streaming his class live. One of the things I was really impressed with was when he wrote Warbreaker, he put it online. He put different drafts online. And I, unfortunately, didn't come across it until he was almost done. But it was very helpful as a writer, and I think also as a reader, to get an idea of what a writer does when they're writing a book, to see different drafts and the changes that they go through and the thinking process. And to have it be like out there for free and giving back to the community, and not just, sometimes it's all about the art, not just about selling books, right? And that was cool. And I think it's neat that he's here at BYU giving back to the college, and that people have an opportunity to learn more from him. I also wanted to mention one of the things I didn't know until a couple days ago was that he wrote 7 books while he was here in his undergrad, and Elantris was the 6th one, though it was first to get published. And that gave me a lot of hope as a writer, because I know a lot of us, when we're trying to write or go forward, maybe we try once, and if it doesn't work, we give up. But clearly, Brandon Sanderson is a talented writer, and he's someone who kept working and waited for other people to come around to discover what he'd been doing. And once they did, it was all over from there. So we'll turn the time over to Brandon.
Thank you very much. What was your name? Michelle? Rochelle. Rochelle. Thank you, Rochelle. Okay. One thing Rochelle didn't mention is that, I wrote 7 books while I was an undergraduate. They were all terrible. I just learned to revise really well, and so Elantris eventually became publishable. If you want to read one of those terrible books, my 7th novel, which is only published in one place, it was my honors thesis at BYU, and is in this library, is the only copy that I know of. I think Dr. Thursby has another one. It's as I was told, I might be wrong on this, it was the only honors thesis in the history of BYU to have to be rebound because it was checked out so often. So that's kind of cool. It may not actually be here because it's often out in interlibrary loan because I refuse to let people read that one because I'm stealing pieces of it for another book. I would like to read from you today from a book called The Way of Kings. It has an interesting history to it. Many of you would probably like me to read to you from the new Wheel of Time book. However, I can't do that for contractual reasons. I can, however, spit out my gum, which I should do. Excuse me. My wife was a middle school teacher for 7 years, and every time she sees me chewing gum and talking, she cringes and almost has a seizure. So, I can't read from the Wheel of Time because I am contractually obligated not to. I could read to you from the one that just came out. There are 3 final volumes. The final volume has been split into 3 pieces. But I generally at readings like to do readings from things that are unpublished, because you come all this way, or maybe downstairs. I don't know. You came from somewhere in order to listen to me read, and I'm going to assume that at least some people in here have already read that book, and so I should come up with something interesting to read for them that is new. So, The Way of Kings. interesting history to this book. I actually started this book when I was a grad student at BYU. My first year of grad school, I had a lot of, well, we all have a lot of failure as writers when you want to break in to whatever type of writing you're trying to do, whether it be academic, whether it be popular fiction like I write. It takes a lot of effort and practice to actually get good at anything. And I had, at that point, written 12 novels. The only publication was my honors thesis at BYU, which doesn't even really count. Not to be to offend BYU, but it's they bound up a nice copy for me. It's like, for my mom to have one or things like that. And I had been rejected a large number of times, and it was getting kind of discouraging at this point. I mean, you write 12 novels and don't sell any of them. You kind of have to have a period of self-reflection, and that's what I did that year, was start having a period of reflection, saying, what am I doing? Can I really do this for a living? Am I ever going to make it? What's going on? And I realized something upon that self-reflection. And what I realized was that I loved writing books. I loved it a lot. It is what I wanted to be doing for the rest of my life, even if no one ever paid me a cent for it. And that was a very liberating revelation. I had been spending the last few years before that writing books that I had not been as enthusiastic about, because I had felt that I would try to adapt my style to something that felt more publishable. So I was saying, okay, what's being published right now? How can I write that? Which is the wrong thing to do as a writer. You want to write what you're passionate about, and then find a way to either sell it or publish it or whatever. And a lot of us have to kind of just stumble through that anyway, because it gets very hard to keep that mantra going in your head after you've not sold for a long time, and you are worried about being, poor and begging for beans on the side of the road or whatever, like your mom has told you will be. Why didn't you just become a doctor like I told you? And so I had written several books that were not very good. I'd written a lot of books that are not very good, but these had felt like a step backward. And so I made the decision, you know what, I'm not going to do that anymore. Everyone's been telling me I write books that are too big. It's one of the things that I've been hearing from editors and I've been seeing. And, I thought, well, you know what, I just write big books. That's what I do. That's what I'm good at. And so I decided I was going to write the biggest, beastliest, most massive, awesome fantasy epic that had ever been conceived. And all the publishers who were rejecting me could just, I didn't care. I was not going to pay attention to what I thought was selling. I was just going to write the best story I could. And I was going to stop caring about selling. And I sat down and I wrote a book called The Way of Kings. I finished it, and shortly thereafter, an editor called me wanting to buy my 6th book, which put me in a sort of strange mindset in that I had just said, all those editors can be darned, I'm going to write whatever I want, and now there's an editor calling me saying, hey, I want to buy your books. Isn't that great? Which was great, but it caught me very unaware, because at that point I hadn't given up on publishing, but I'd given up on the editorial establishment. And so he had read a launch list and loved it and wanted to publish it, and he said, we usually don't sign people up for just one book because we want to show faith in them as an author, so what else do you have? And I said, well, I've got this book, and I sent it to him. And he read it, and then he called me and he said, what was that? This is huge. It was like 350,000 words. It was just, it was enormous. Yeah, John is just cringing because he's a writer and he thinks in word counts. You guys think in pages, but pages are very fluid in the publishing industry. But my Alcatraz books are 50,000 words. So this is 7 of those stacked on top of each other. Gathering Storm, the Wheel of Time book, was 300,000. So it was even longer than that. And it had like a dozen viewpoint characters, 6 main viewpoint characters, and they were all over the world, and it was insane. It was absolutely insane. And he called me and he said, I'm not sure, he said, really, what is this? And this is really interesting, but I don't know that your career is ready for this right now. Do you have anything that's maybe a little less ambitious? And we talked it over for a while, and really the truth was I hadn't been ready to publish that book then. I hadn't been ready to write it when I tried it. My skill was not up to juggling that many viewpoints, which is really a hard thing. If any of you are aspiring writers and you like writing fantasy, realize that the more viewpoints you add, the difficulty increases exponentially. And it's much easier to write a great book with 2 or 3 viewpoints than it is to write a great book with 6 or a dozen. And, write what's in your heart, but if you're equally interested in writing a story that has 2 viewpoints and one that has 13, I might suggest the 2-viewpoint one to start. And so I said to my editor, you know what, I've got this other really great idea. I wrote some really terrible books that use some good ideas that I've really been sad about. One of them was called Mistborn, and one of them was called The Final Empire. I want to take those and actually make them not suck. I've got some really great ideas, and those stories I'm sad about because that was during my chasing the market era, and when I really should have just been trusting myself. And so I said, let me write a book called Mistborn: The Final Empire, and let's send that to you. And I wrote that and I sent it to him, and it was he really liked it, and it became the follow-up to Elantris, and I did a trilogy of those, which taught me a lot about writing a series and juggling multiple viewpoints. And then I went and wrote a standalone called Warbreaker, which has been posted on my website for free if you just want to download it and read it. You can read all of the old drafts are there too, so you can compare them and see where I made stupid mistakes and then fix them. And about that time, I kind of understood where my career was going. Everything was great. Everything was hunky-dory. And then I went downstairs one morning, and I picked up my phone and checked my voicemail, and there was a phone call from Harriet McDougall, who was Robert Jordan's widow, who said, "Hi, Brandon Sanderson. Would you please call me back? There's something I want to talk to you about." That's the first I heard of it. If you're not familiar with The Wheel of Time, it has sold 40 million copies worldwide. And the last 5 books have been #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. And a little more personal aspect, I started reading them when I was 15, and they had been my favorite book series from my teenage years that I had followed for many, many years. I called back Harriet, and yes, she wanted me to finish The Wheel of Time. Robert Jordan had passed away before he had finished the climax of his series, and she wanted me to be the one that took his materials and his notes and put together the ending of the series, which was completely flabbergasting. Unexpected. Like I said, I know where my career is going. Whoa! It has been the most surreal experience of my life. My wife jokes that the day I got that phone call, I was more nervous about that than the day I'd gotten married to her. She's a little bit bitter about that. But I had months to get ready for the wedding. This came out of nowhere, literally. And so I hesitantly said yes, and that's what I've been working on for quite a while now. Meanwhile, in the middle of working on those books, Tom Doherty, the CEO of Tor, founder of Tor, Tor Books is a monolith in the field. They just a wonderful publisher. I'm very glad to be with them. Publish Orson Scott Card as well. Called me up and said, "Brandon, I just realized that we don't have a solo Brandon Sanderson title for 2010. And I'm like, "Yes, Tom, I've been working on The Wheel of Time, which, you've asked me to, do this little task of completing the greatest fantasy epic of my generation." And Tom says, "Yeah, I know, but we'd really like to have one of your own. Your fans need a book too, so what can you do about that?" And I said, I don't know, Tom. I've got this book. Let me tell you about this book that horrified my editor when I sent it to him. It's called The Way of Kings, and I think I could write it now. I couldn't write it when I first tried it. I wasn't good enough, but I think I can do it now. And he said, "Well, give it a try." So I did. I took the summer after finishing The Gathering Storm, and I redrafted it from scratch. I didn't keep any of the old words, but I kept the characters and plot and setting that I had worked out before, and I wrote it again from scratch. and that is The Way of Kings, version 2.0, which I then sent to my editor, and he said, wow, this is really scary, but this is really good, and he quite liked it. And so The Way of Kings will be finally being published in August of this year. This is, I really don't know what people are going to think of this book, because it is completely written without any concept of, market or anything like that. It is just me wanting to write the biggest, baddest, nastiest, coolest epic that could ever be written. And so it mixes literary concepts like nonlinear storytelling and with majestic knights in magical power armor who punch through walls. And so, am I able to meld those two concepts? I'm not very sure. I think I did, but I don't know what people are going to think of it. I'm approaching it from a multi-genre approach, and including somewhere around 16 to 18 illustrations, which are not actually illustrations of the book. They are pieces of art from the world posted into into the book. So, for instance, one of the characters is a natural historian. Think, like Darwin going on his voyages and drawing the animals he runs across. She likes to do this. When she sees a cool animal, she sketches it. And we're including her sketches as part of the book, where you'll just run across a page where it's full of notations and sketches that she has done of one of the wacky creatures from the world. And so we're doing that. There are pages from illuminated manuscripts. There's all sorts of weird stuff, multi-genre sort of things going on, while our knights punch through walls and slay giant monsters. So it's just everything I love packed together into one book. Mixed in with random segments that are just, Anyway, I don't even know how to describe this book to people, as you might be able to tell. I really have no idea what people are going to think of it. It's a very large book, very hard to give a description on. I'm going to go ahead and read to you, let's see. I want to read something that, that the people who have heard me read before have not heard. So, let's see. Why don't I'll jump through a couple of different places and read a couple of different things. So, have you guys heard me read from Shalon? I did read from Shalon for you. So let's go ahead and let's read from Dalinar. Let's read, this is a scene from chapter 13, but it's where a character gets introduced. I'm just going to read a little bit of this, and we'll see where it goes. Today, the king announced, riding beneath the bright open sky, is an excellent day to kill a god, wouldn't you say? Undoubtedly, your majesty. Sadius's reply was smooth, quick, and said with a knowing smile. Sadius was usually like that. One might say that gods, as a rule, should fear the Alethi nobility. Most of us, at least. Adolin gripped his reins a little more tightly. It put him on edge every time that man spoke. Adolin itched to summon his shardblade and cut the smile off that man's face. Do we have to ride up here at the front? Renarin whispered. I want to listen, Adolin replied softly. The two rode just to the side of the king and his high princes. Sadius was to the king's left, and Dalinar, Adolin's father, was a solid figure riding at the king's right. The final high prince on the hunt was Vama. He trailed along to the right, speaking with his attendants. Behind them extended a grand procession, 1,000 soldiers in Kholin blue, dozens of servants, huntmasters, and even women in palanquins to scribe accounts of the hunt. The king was resplendent in his golden shard plate. Of course, plate could make any man look regal. Even Sadius looked impressive when wearing his red suit, though his bulbous face and ruddy complexion spoiled the presentation. Adolin's own set was painted a deep Kholin blue. Some men who wore plate claimed that it was so light they barely noticed it, but Adolin couldn't help but notice the difference. While in the armor, his every movement was enhanced. You couldn't so much as lift your arm without it reacting with unexpected speed and strength. It took practice to use plate correctly, and he was still caught by surprise at times, though he'd held this suit, inherited from his mother's side of the family, since his 16th birthday. That was 7 years past now. Sadeas and the king flaunted their plate. And, well, Adolin knew that he did as well. The bright metallic colors, the flowing capes, the metal adornments welded into place on helm and pauldrons to give an extra look of danger and litheness. How could you not show off when wearing something as grand as shard plate? Only one shard bearer in the procession, indeed only one shard bearer in the entirety of the 10 armies, used no paint or ornamentations. Dalinar Kholin, Adolin's father, was the 4th and final shard bearer on the hunt. He preferred the slate gray color of natural plate. High Prince Vema didn't have any shards of his own. Adolin's father rode beside the king, his face somber as he listened. He had his helm off, hanging from his saddle, and his square face was topped by short black hair that had gone white at the temples. Few women had ever called Dalinar Kholin handsome. His nose was the wrong shape, his features blocky rather than delicate. It was the face of a soldier. He rode astride a massive black Rashadium stallion, one of the largest horses that Adolin had ever seen. And while the king and Sadeas looked regal in their armor, somehow Dalinar managed the look of a soldier. To him, the plate was not an ornament, it was a tool. Dalinar never seemed surprised, even a hint, by the strength of the speed plate lent him. Even after he first put the plate on following several days without, it was as if, for Dalinar Kholin, wearing his plate was his natural state, and the times without were abnormal. Perhaps that was one reason why he'd earned a reputation as being one of the greatest warriors and generals who had ever lived. Adolin found himself wishing, passionately, that his father would do a little bit more these days to live up to that reputation. He's thinking about the visions again, Adolin thought, regarding his father's distant expression and troubled eyes. It happened again last night, Adolin said softly to Renarin, during the high storm. I know, Renarin said. His voice was measured, controlled. He always paused before he replied to a question, as if testing the words in his mind. It made others uncomfortable. Rilla said Renarin's ways made her feel as if he were dissecting her with his mind. She'd shiver when she spoke to him, though Adolin had never found his younger brother the least bit discomforting. Perhaps he was just accustomed to Renarin's quirks. What do you think they mean? Adolin asked, speaking quietly so only Renarin could hear. Father's episodes. I don't know. Renarin, we can't keep ignoring them. The soldiers are beginning to talk. Stormfather, the other war camps know too. It's spreading through all 10 armies. Dalinar Kholin, the Blackthorn, uncle of the king and high prince of the Kholin princedom, was going mad. Whenever a high storm came, he fell to the floor and began to shake, and then he began raving in gibberish. Often he'd stand, eyes delusional and wild, and begin swinging and flailing. Adolin often had to restrain him lest he hurt himself or others. He sees things, Renarin said quietly, or he thinks he does. I know. Dalinar had yet to say what he saw, but it was obvious from the way that he acted after the fits. Obvious from the way he acted after the fits, the questions he asked, the comments he made, that he had seen something. Adolin's grandfather had suffered from delusions. When he'd grown old, he had thought that he was reliving the days of his youth spent at war. Was that what was happening to Dalinar? Was he reliving the early battles of his youth, days when he'd earned his renown? Or was it that terrible night that he saw over and over, the night when his brother the king had been murdered by the assassin in white? Dalinar often mentioned the night's radiance soon after the episodes. Was he pretending that he was one of them? It made Adolin feel sick. His mother had once told him that every son had to learn someday that his father was just a man, imperfect, human, fallible, and incapable of living up to a young boy's expectations. Dalinar Kholin, however, wasn't just another man. He was the Blackthorn, a near undefeatable warrior. Together, he and his brother had reunited Alethkar's warring high princes after centuries of strife. The older Adolin had grown, the more he'd realized that his mother had been well-meaning but wrong. Dalinar had lived up to each and every expectation Adolin had ever had, and many more that the young Adolin hadn't known he should have had. That didn't make it any less painful to see his father's age begin to show. What did you do as a son when the man you loved, the greatest man alive, started to lose his wits? To the side, Sadeas began boasting about a recent victory. He'd won another gem heart 2 days back, and the king, it appeared, hadn't heard of it. Adolin frowned at the boasts. We should move back, Renarin said. We're of rank enough to be here, Adolin replied. I don't like how tense you get when you're around Sadeas. It's not like you. We have to keep an eye on the man, Renarin, Adolin thought. He knows father is weakening. He'll try to strike at him. He forced himself to smile, however. He tried very hard to be calm and confident, if only for Renarin's sake. Their father could be an austere, stern man. Both Dalinar and Renarin could benefit from seeing that it's all right to relax once in a while. Generally, Adolin was quite fond of relaxing. He'd happily spend his entire life dueling, lounging, and courting the occasional pretty girl. Life didn't seem content to let him enjoy the simple pleasures, however. Sadeas and the king were talking again. Model of courage lately, Sadeas, the king was saying. You've done very well in capturing gem hearts. You are to be commended. Thank you, your majesty. Though the competition has been rather unexciting lately, as some people seem like they aren't even interested in participating. I guess that even the best of swords get dull after a while. Not shard blades, the king said. Good point, that. Adolin's father, who might once have responded to the veiled implications of weakness, said nothing. He only rode on, eyes forward, distracted by the thoughts in his head, thoughts brought on by his growing madness. Adolin gritted his teeth. It was flat out unconscionable for Sadeas to be taking snaps at his father in this state. Perhaps it would be all right to summon his blade, give the idiot man a challenge. You didn't duel high princes, it just wasn't dead, not unless you were ready to make a big storm of it, but maybe he was. Maybe. Adolin, Renarin said warningly. Adolin looked to the side. He put out his hand as if to summon his blade. He steeled himself, then picked up his reins with the hand instead. Storming man, he thought. Leave my father alone. Why don't we talk about the hunt? Renarin said, obviously trying to distract him. As usual, the younger Colin rode with a straight back and perfect posture, eyes hidden beneath his spectacles, a model of propriety and solemnity. Aren't you excited about it? Bah, Adolin said. I don't know. I never find hunts interesting as everyone says they're going to be. I don't care how big a beast we're after. In the end, it's really just butchery. Now, dueling, that was exciting. The feel of the shard blade in hand, facing someone crafty, skilled, and careful. Man against man, strength against strength, mind against mind. Hunting some dumb beast, no matter how large, just couldn't compare to that. Maybe you should have invited Janala along, Renarin said. She wouldn't have come. Not after, well, you know, Rilla was very vocal yesterday. Probably best to leave the camp. To the side, the king began complaining about something. Renarin and Adolin had lagged behind a little, and Adolin couldn't quite hear what was being said. Really should be wiser in your treatment of her. Should have been wiser in your treatment of her, Renarin said, sounding disapproving. Adolin mumbled a non-informative reply, hoping to avoid another lecture. It wasn't his fault that his relationships often burned out quickly. Well, technically this one was his fault, but it wasn't usually. This was just an oddity. Let's ride up closer, Adolin said. I need to hear what's going on. Renarin rolled his eyes, but followed. Line break. Unite them. The words whispered in Dalinar's mind. He couldn't be rid of them. They consumed him as he trotted gallant across a rocky, boulder-strewn plateau on the shattered plains. Shouldn't we be there by now? The king asked. We're still 2 or 3 plateaus away from the hunting site, your majesty, Dalinar said, distracted. It will be another hour, perhaps, observing proper protocols. If we had a vantage, we could probably see the pavilion to... Vantage? Would that rock formation up ahead do? I suppose, Dalinar said, inspecting the tower-like length of rock. We could send scouts to check, if you wish. Scouts? Bah! I need a run, uncle. I'll bet you 5 full broams that I can beat you to the top. And with that, the king galloped away in a thunder of hooves, leaving a shocked group of light-eyed attendants and guards behind. Storm it? Dalinar cursed, discarding his thoughts for the moment and kicking his horse into motion. Adolin, you have command. Secure the next plateau, just in case. His son, who had been lagging behind, nodded sharply. He'd been handling command of the procession for most of the crossings anyway. Dalinar galloped after the king, a figure in golden armor and a long blue cape. Hoofbeats pounded the stone, rock formations whipping it past. Ahead, the steep spire-like length of rock rose from the lip of the plateau. Such formations weren't uncommon out here on the shattered plains. Curse that boy. He still thought of Elhokar as a boy, though the king was in his 27th year. Sometimes he acted like a boy, though. Why couldn't he give more warning before leaping into one of these stunts? Still, as Dalinar rode, he admitted to himself that it did feel good to charge freely, visor open, face to the wind. His pulse ticked. I just noticed a typo. Face to the wind. His pulse picked up as he got into the race, and he forgave the impetuous beginning. For a moment, Dalinar let himself forget his troubles and the words that had been echoing in his head. The king wanted a race? Well, Dalinar would give him one. He charged past the king. Elhokar's stallion was a good breed, but it could never match Gallant, who was a full Rashadium, 2 hands taller and several times stronger than an ordinary horse. The animals chose their own riders, and there were nearly as few chosen in the army as there were shard bearers. The 2 groups didn't often overlap. Only Only 3 men in Alethkar had all three, Plaid, Blade, and Rashadium. Dalinar was one, Adolin was another. In seconds, Dalinar reached the formation's base. He threw himself from the saddle while Gallant was still moving. He hit hard, but the shard plate absorbed the impact, stones crunching beneath his feet as he skidded to a stop. Men who have never worn plate, particularly those who were accustomed to its inferior cousin, simple plate and mail, could never understand. Shard plate wasn't merely armor, it was so much more. He ran to the bottom of the rock formation as Elokar galloped up behind. Dalinar leapt, plate-assisted legs propelling him up some 8 feet, and grabbed a handhold in the stone. With a heave, he pulled himself up, the plate lending him the strength of many men. The thrill of contest began to rise within him. It wasn't nearly as keen as the thrill of battle, but it was a worthy substitute. He grabbed another ledge, climbing the steep wall. Rock scraped below. Elokar had begun to climb as well. Dalinar didn't look down. He kept his eyes fixed on a small rock platform at the top of the 20-foot-high formation. He groped with steel-covered fingers, finding another handhold. The gauntlets covered his hands, but the ancient armor somehow transferred sensation to his fingers. It was as if he were wearing only thin leather gloves. Scraping came from the right, accompanied by a voice cursing softly. Elokar had taken a different path, hoping to pass Dalinar. However, the king had found himself at a section without handholds, and his progress was stalled. The king's golden shard plate glittered as he glanced at Dalinar, meeting his eyes. Elokar set his jaw and looked upward, then launched himself in a powerful leap toward an outcropping. Fool boy, Dalinar thought, watching the armored king seem to hang in the air for a moment before he snatched the protruding rock and dangled. Then the king pulled himself up and continued to climb. Dalinar moved furiously, stone grinding beneath his metal fingertips, chips falling free and bouncing against the sides of the formation. The wind ruffled his cape. He heaved, strained, pushing himself, and managed to get just ahead of the king. The top was just feet away. The thrill sung at him. He reached for the goal, determined to win. He couldn't lose. He had to unite them. He hesitated just briefly, not quite certain why, and let his nephew get ahead. Elokar hauled himself to his feet atop the rock formation and laughed in triumph. He turned toward Dalinar, holding out a hand. Storm winds, uncle, but you made a fine race of it. At the end there, I thought you had me for sure. The triumph and joy in Elokar's face brought a smile to Dalinar's lips. The younger man needed victories this day. Even little ones would do him good. Glory spren, like tiny golden translucent globes of light, began to pop into existence around him, attracted by a sense of accomplishment. Blessing himself for hesitating, Dalinar took the king's hand, letting Elokar pull him up. There was just enough room on the top of the natural tower for both of them. I think I'm going to stop there with Dalinar's thing and see if I can find you something I was working on just recently that's not quite even complete. So, I don't know where I put it. I took it off of my other computer and stuck it on here, so we'll see if I can find it. If I can't find it in a moment or two, I'll read something else, but, talk among yourselves or something like that. Let's see, where would I have put that? I thought I knew where this was.
Somebody in the front row should get up on the table and do a dance.
Oh, wow. Don't tempt them. They'll do it. Where did I stick that? Well, I will have to read that one at my other reading tonight for LTUE. I'm just going to go ahead and read to you from a quick section from Shallan. Some of these guys have already heard it, but they'll have to deal with it because that's what I'm going to read. But I'll read the other one at the other reading. I have another reading at 5 o'clock in conjunction with Life, the Universe, and Everything, which is BYU's Science Fiction Symposium, of which I am guest of honor this year. Yay! Here is a short section from Shalon, who is one of our other main viewpoint characters, just to kind of show a different perspective on other things that are happening in the book, because there are way too many of them. The book stands at 420,000 words right now. I'm going to cut that down, but that's how long it is at this moment. Yeah. This is the epigraph. I haven't finished the epigraphs for the other chapters, but this one has one. That's a little thing in italics at the top of the chapter. A man stood on a cliffside and watched his homeland fall to dust. The waters surged beneath, so far beneath, and he heard a child crying. They were his own tears. Collected on the 4th of Ptolemies, year 1171, 30 seconds before death. Subject was a cobbler of some renown. Chapter 3, City of Bells. Carbranth, City of Bells, was not a place Shalon had ever imagined that she would visit. Though she'd often dreamed of traveling, she'd expected to spend her early life sequestered in her family's manor, only escaping through the books of her father's library. She'd expected to later marry one of her father's allies and then spend the rest of her life sequestered in his manor instead. But expectations were like fine pottery. The harder you clutched them, the more likely they were to crack. She found herself breathless, clutching her leather-browned... Oh, there's 2 clutches there. That's a good... This is actually the file that I'm going to send to be published, so I can edit it. She found herself breathless, clutching her leather-bound drawing pad to her chest as longshoremen pulled the ship into the dock. Carbranth was enormous. Built up the side of a steep incline, the city was shaped like a bowl, like a half bowl, with open side toward the ocean. The buildings were blocky, with square windows, and appeared to have been constructed from some kind of mud or daub. Creme, perhaps? They were painted bright colors, reds and oranges most often, but occasionally blues and yellows too. She could hear the bells already, tinkling in the wind, ringing with pure voices. She had to strain her neck to look up toward the city's loftiest rim. Carbranth was like a mountain towering over her. How many people lived in a place like this? Thousands? Tens of thousands? She shivered again, excited yet daunted, then blinked pointedly, fixing the image of the city rising above her in her memory. Sailors rushed about. The Wind's Pleasure was a narrow, single-sailed vessel, barely large enough for her, the captain, his wife, and the half-dozen crew. It had seemed so small to her at first, but Captain Zosbeck was a calm and cautious man, and an excellent sailor, even if he was a pagan. He'd guided the ship with care along the coast, always finding a sheltered cove to ride out high storms. The captain oversaw the work as the men began securing the mooring. Zosbeck was a short man, even shoulder with Shalon, and he wore his long, white Thalian eyebrows up in a curious spiked pattern. It was like he had 2 waving fans above his eyes, a foot long each. He wore a simple knit cap and a silver-buttoned black coat. She'd imagined his getting that scar on his jaw in a furious sea battle with pirates. The day before, she'd been disappointed to hear that it had been caused by a loose block and tackle during rough weather. His wife, Ashliv, was already walking down the gangplank to register their vessel along with the dock scribes. The captain himself saw Shalon inspecting him and walked over. He was a business connection of her family and had her father's trust. That was good, since the plan she and her brothers had concocted had contained no place for her bringing a lady-in-waiting or nurse along. That plan made Shalon nervous, very, very nervous. She hated being duplicitous, but the financial state of her house? Well, they either needed a spectacular infusion of wealth or some other edge in local Vaden house politics. Otherwise, they wouldn't last the year. First things first, Shalon told herself, forcing herself to be calm. Find Yasna Kolin, assuming she hasn't moved on without you again. I've sent a lad on your behalf, Brightness, Zosbeck said. If the princess is still here, we shall soon know. Shalon nodded gratefully, still clutching her drawing pad, watching the city. There were people everywhere. Some wore familiar clothing, trousers and shirts that laced up the front for the men, skirts and colorful blouses for the women. Those could have been from her homeland, Yakoved. But Carbranth was a free city, barred to no foreigner. A small, politically fragile city-state, it held little territory, but it had docks open to all ships that passed, and it asked no questions about the nationality or status. People flowed to it, those who could afford to come by ship anyway, since it was all but inaccessible from land. That meant many of the people she saw were exotic. Those single-sheet wraps would mark a man from being from Tashik, far to the west. The long coats, enveloping down to the ankles, but open at the front like cloaks, where did those come from? She'd rarely seen so many parshmen as she noted working on the docks, carrying cargo on their backs. Like the parchment her father had owned, these were stout and thick of limb, with their oddly marbled skin, some parts pale, others a deep crimson. The mottled pattern was unique to each individual. They weren't tattoos, that's just how they were born. Some groups were light-skinned like Avoran, and some were black like Azish, but always with that red marbling. After chasing Yasna Kholin from town to town for the better part of 6 months, Shallan was beginning to think that she'd never catch the woman. Was the lady avoiding her? No, that didn't seem likely. Shallan wasn't important enough to wait for. She was an inconsequential young woman of 17 from a reclusive Vaden house, while Brightness Yasna was one of the most powerful women in the world, and one of the most infamous. Yasna Kholin was the only member of a faithful royal house who was a professed heretic. Shallan tried not to let herself grow anxious. Most likely she'd discover that Yasna had moved on again. The Wind's Pleasure would dock for the night to resupply, and Shallan would negotiate a price with the captain, steeply discounted because of her family's investments into Sazbek's shipping business, to take her to the next port. Already, they were months past the time when Sazbek had expected to be rid of her. She'd never sensed resentment from him. His honor and loyalty kept him agreeing to her requests. His patience wouldn't last forever, however, and neither would her money. She'd already used over half the spheres she'd brought with her. He wouldn't abandon her in an unfamiliar city, of course, but he might regretfully insist on taking her back to Vadenar. "Captain," a soldier said, rushing up the gameplate. He wore only a vest and loose, baggy trousers and had the darkly tanned skin of one who worked in the sun. "No message, sir. Dock register says that Yasna hasn't left yet." "Ha!" the captain said, turning to Shallan. "The hunt is over." "Bless the heralds," Shallan said softly. The captain smiled broadly, flamboyant eyebrows looking like streaks of sunlight coming from his eyes. "It must be your beautiful face which brought us this favorable wind. The Windspren themselves were entranced by you, Brightness Shallan, and led us here with such swiftness." Shallan blushed, smiling to herself as she considered a response that wasn't particularly proper. "Ah," the captain said, pointing at her, "I can see that you have a reply. I see it in your eyes, young miss. Spit it out. Words aren't meant to be kept inside, you see. They are free creatures, and if locked away, they will unsettle the stomach." "It's not polite," Shallan protested. Sazbek bellowed a laugh. "Months of travel and still you claim that. I keep telling you that we're sailors. We forgot how to be polite the moment we first set foot on a ship. We're far beyond redemption now." Shallan smiled. She'd been trained very sternly by her nurses and tutors to hold her tongue. Unfortunately, her brothers had been even more determined to encourage her to let out the things she thought. She made a habit of entertaining them with her comments quietly while no one else was near. She thought fondly of hours spent by the crackling great-room hearth, her 3 brothers huddled around her, listening as she made sport of their father's newest sycophant or a traveling ardent. She'd often fabricated silly versions of conversations to fill the mouths of people they could see, but could not hear. That had created in her what her nurses referred to as an insolent streak. And the longer she traveled away from nurses, proper sitting gardens, and her father's stuffy manner, the more bold she found herself growing. The sailors, it turned out, were even more appreciative of a witty comment than her brothers had been. "Well," she said to the captain, blushing but still eager to speak, "I was just thinking this. You said that my beauty coaxed the winds to deliver us to Kharbranth with haste. But wouldn't that imply that on our other trips, my lack of beauty was to blame for us arriving late?" "Well, so in reality," Shallan said, "you're telling me that I'm beautiful precisely 1/6 of the time." "Nonsense, young miss. You're like a morning sunrise, you are. Like a sunrise. By that you mean entirely too crimson." She pulled at her long red hair, "and prone to making men grouchy when they see me." He laughed, and several sailors nearby joined in. "All right, then," Captain Sazbek said. "You're like a flower." She grimaced. "I'm allergic to flowers." He raised an eyebrow. "No, really," she admitted. I think they're quite captivating, but if you were to give me a bouquet, you'd soon find me in a fit so energetic that it'll have you searching the walls for stray freckles I might have blown free at the force of my sneezes." "Well, be that true, I still say you're as pretty as a flower. And if I am," she noted, "then the young men my age must be afflicted with the same allergy, for they keep their distance from me quite noticeably." She grimaced. "See, now I told you this wasn't polite. Young women should not act in such an irritable way." The captain just smiled. "Ah, young miss," he said, tapping his knit cap toward her. "The lads and I will miss your clever tongue. I'm not sure what we'll do without you." "Sail, likely," she said, grinning, "and eat and sing and watch the waves. All the things you do now, only you shall have more time to accomplish it, as you won't be stumbling across a youthful girl as she sits on your deck and gets in the way, sketching and mumbling to herself. But you have my thanks, Captain, for a trip that was wonderful, if somewhat exaggerated in length. He tipped his cap to her in thanks. She hadn't expected being out on her own to be quite so liberating. Her brothers had worried that she'd be frightened. They saw her as timid because she didn't like to argue or be in conflict with others, and generally remained quiet when large groups were talking. They underestimated her. Being away from Vadenar was daunting, true, but it was also wonderful. She'd filled 3 sketchbooks already with pictures of the creatures and people she'd seen. And while her worry over her house's finances was a perpetual cloud above her, it was balanced by the sheer delight of experience. Got a few more minutes. There's something else. Yeah, okay. Tosbeck began making arrangements for the ship to remain in dock. He was a good man, and as for his praise of her supposed beauty, well, she took that for what it was. Kind, if somewhat overstated, marks of affection. She was pale-skinned in an era when a Lethe tan was seen as the mark of true beauty, and her impure family line was manifest in her pure auburn red hair, not a single lock of proper black. Her freckles had faded when she reached young womanhood, heralds be blessed, but there were still some visible, dusting her cheeks and nose. "Young miss," the captain said after conferring with his men, your brightness Yasna, she'll undoubtedly be at the conclave, you see." "Conclave? Yes, it's where the king lives, where the Athenaeum is. It's the center of the city, so to speak, except it's on the top." He scratched his chin. "Well, anyway, brightness Yasna Colin is sister to a king. She'll stay nowhere else, not in Carbranth. Yalb here will show you the way. We can deliver your trunk once you've located your patron." Many thanks, Captain," she said. "Shaler Macabak Naur. The winds have brought us safely," a phrase of thanks in the Thanelan language. The captain smiled broadly. "Mackay Beatus Fortenthus." She had no idea what that meant. Her Thanelan was quite good when reading, but she'd found these last months that listening was something different entirely. She smiled at him, which seemed the proper response, for he laughed, gesturing to one of his sailors. "We'll wait here in the docks for 2 days," he told her. "There's a high storm coming tomorrow, you see, so we cannot leave anyway. If the situation with the Lady Yasna does not proceed as you hope, we'll take you back to Yakoved." "Thank you again." "'Tis nothing, young miss. Nothing but what we'd be doing anyway. Besides, that's a right nice likeness of my wife you gave me for my cabin. Right nice." He strode over to Yalb, giving him instructions. Shalon waited, apprehensively, putting her drawing pad back in her leather portfolio. Yalb. The name was difficult for a Vaden tongue to pronounce. Why were the Thalens so fond of mashing letters together without proper vowels to give them space? Yalb waved for her as she moved to follow. "Be careful with yourself, lass," the captain warned as she passed. "Even a safe city like Carbranth hides dangers. Keep your wits about you." I think I should prefer my wits inside my skull, Captain," she replied carefully. "If I keep them about me instead, then someone has gotten entirely too close to my head with a cudgel." We will stop there.